In the biting cold of May 1945, 0.3, at a makeshift detention camp near the city of Frankfurt, Hour 3, an unprecedented scene in the history of warfare was unfolding. Hour 5. Lines of young women, who only weeks before had been the pride of the Nazi female auxiliary forces, stood trembling in ash-gray uniforms. #0.3, tattered and caked in mud. 05. Their eyes could not conceal their terror as they watched the arrival of American military trucks. At that moment, a logistics officer from the U-5 90th Infantry Division stepped down. 0.55. But instead of bared weapons or harsh sentences, at 0.3, he ordered the crates at the back of the vehicles to be pried open. A profound twist occurred, M0.3, leaving hundreds of female prisoners breathless. 0.5. Before them lay not shovels or forced labor tools, M0.3, but thousands of rolls of fabric and vibrant floral dresses, and 0.3, donated by American women from across the ocean. Paris. For the first time in years of iron discipline and the fires of war, these women were ordered to strip away the uniforms bearing the eagle and swastika to clothe themselves in flowers. Stunned disbelief was etched on every face as the line between enemy and humanity suddenly blurred, severed by a single piece of soft fabric. Why did the American military execute such an impossibly strange act in the heart of hatred? The answer was not mere kindness, 1.3d, but a profound psychological strategy aimed at completely erasing the remnants of fascism from the minds of these young people. 0.5. Join us as we delve into these untold stories to understand why those floral dresses held more power than 1,000 rifles in conquering the most defiant hearts of the Third Reich. To understand the shock experienced by the female prisoners at the Frankfurt camp, matter 0.3, we must turn back time to the final days of the Second World War in the European theater. Sub 0.5. It was the spring of 1945, Amber 0.3, as the specter of the Third Reich collapsed under suffocating pressure from two sides. Abban 0.5. In the east, the Soviet Red Army swept through like a firestorm, while in the west, the Allied forces, spearheaded by American and British troops, crossed the Rhine, advancing into the heart of Germany. During this period, the German army was no longer the invincible war machine it had been in the early 1940s. To compensate for the severe manpower shortage following catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front, at 0.3, the Hitler regime mobilized hundreds of thousands of women into the auxiliary forces, 0.3, known as Helferinnen. These were not merely office workers or nurses. Many directly operated radar stations, and 0.3, controlled anti-aircraft guns, and 0.3, or handled communications at frontline headquarters. 0.5. According to declassified military reports, Namshar 0.3, by the end of the war, Manashar 0.3, over 500,000 German women were in uniform. Mepr 0.3, serving across various units of the Nazi military. Nam 0.5. As the American pincer closed, Mab 0.3, thousands of these women fell into Allied hands. Nab 0.5 Ross. In the Ruhr Pocket Campaign alone, Emperor 0.3 the U, 0.55 Ross, S, Arthur 0.5 Ross. Military captured a staggering mass of over 325,000 prisoners, Mempadaron 3 Ross, including tens of thousands of women. These female prisoners were taken to makeshift camps hastily erected across the fields of Western Germany. 0.5. The terrain was nothing but mud and open ground churned up by tank treads, and the erratic spring weather, with its cold drizzles, made living conditions in the POW camps exceptionally harsh. Bombs. In the diary of a female auxiliary named Elsa, captured near the city of Marburg, she wrote desperate lines. 005 wow. We stood in the rain for 48 hours. The uniforms on our bodies rotted and soaked, the cold seeping into our very bones. But the fear of what the Americans would do to us was more terrifying than death itself. 5. These women had been raised by Goebbels' propaganda machine for 12 years. They believed the Americans were savages and that they would face humiliation or execution upon capture. As there were 5. However, the reality in the American-run camps was vastly different from what they had imagined. As there 5. Historical military experts later noted that the U.S. military faced an unprecedented logistical crisis when the number of prisoners exceeded expectations by 400%. 0.5. Providing food, 0.33. Water, 0.33. And especially clothing for tens of thousands of women in a state of rags was a daunting puzzle. 5. The ash-gray uniforms they wore were not only symbols of a defeated ideology, but also the source of disease and lice due to poor sanitation. Amidst this chaos and suspicion, a decision was made that was both humanitarian and strategically calculated. All old uniforms bearing fascist symbols were to be destroyed, and these women were to be given an entirely new appearance. This was the first micro-reward for those who had survived the nightmare of war, a change not only in outward appearance, but the beginning of the psychological re-education of an entire generation. Behind those crates filled with floral dresses and civilian clothes was more than just a spontaneous act of charity. Mr. 5 says it was in fact, 0.3 part of a massive de-nazification plan that you, 0.5. Military psychologists had meticulously developed even before the fighting ended. The Allied generals understood that defeating the German army on the battlefield was only half the journey. The other half, more difficult and enduring, was uprooting the extremist ideology that had seeped into the flesh and blood of millions of German youth, especially the young women in the auxiliary forces, 5, at U-05 SARS S 0.5, military rear headquarters, 0.3 SARS. Intelligence reports revealed a concerning reality, on 0.5. The loyalty of female auxiliaries to the old regime was often more persistent than that of male soldiers. They were considered the keepers of the Reich's will, and the ash-gray uniform with the eagle insignia was the final bond tethering them to a misguided past. 5. An analysis by psychological warfare experts at the U.S. Office of Strategic Services indicated that to change a person's mindset, one must first change their environment and appearance. 5 fall. Forcing female prisoners to burn their uniforms was not just about eradicating lice or maintaining hygiene. It was a symbolic act aimed at severing all ties with fascist organizations. 0.5. However, 0.3 within the American command. Handwrite 0.33. Heated debates erupted over providing supplies to prisoners, while some hardline officers believed they should only provide the bare minimum for survival. 3. Those leading the Civil Affairs Department saw another opportunity. 0.5 points. They mobilized support from humanitarian organizations in the United States to ship millions of tons of civilian clothing, 3 and footwear, 3 and personal items, 5. Recorded data shows that in April and May 1945, 4.3, over 20 relief ships docked at European ports, 4.3, carrying the hope of a normal life for the newly defeated, 5. The logistical pressure was immense. Every day, 3, the female POW camps consumed dozens of tons of food and hygiene supplies. 5. The American soldiers on guard duty were also initially filled with skepticism. They had witnessed the horrific crimes of Nazi Germany during their advance, and now they had to protect and care for the very people who had served that machine. Nevertheless, strict U.S. military discipline and the policy of humane treatment for prisoners under the Geneva Convention were rigorously enforced. An unexpected detail was recorded in the files of the 3rd Armored Division WWII. When American soldiers saw German female prisoners sobbing upon receiving soap and mirrors, their hatred seemed to vanish. They realized that beneath the rigid uniforms were fragile women, people swept up in the cruel vortex of history. The contrast between the brutality of the fascist regime and the calculated compassion of the Americans was the most powerful psychological lever. This was the promise of a new future where they were no longer defined by gun barrels and marching songs, but by freedom and personal dignity. This meticulous preparation laid the groundwork for one of the smoothest transitions of power and ideology in post-war history, leading us to the haunting, multidimensional perspectives of those involved, where barriers of language and hatred were gradually dismantled by small but grand humanitarian gestures. The first perspective comes from living witnesses, homosexual POWs. Let us listen to the story of Hannah, HQ-I-III, a 19-year-old communications auxiliary captured in the Bavarian region. In her memoirs, HQ-I-III, she described the terrifying moment she was surrounded by a group of American infantrymen. 5. She had prepared a poison pill, believing the propaganda that the Americans would massacre everyone. But instead of firing, a young American soldier approached. HQ-I-III pulled out a chocolate bar. HQ-I-III shared it with her. HQ-I-III and said in broken German, 0.5. The war is over. 0.33. You can go home. 0.5. Hannah shared that this very chocolate bar collapsed the entire belief system she had been taught since childhood. 0.5. It was the first small reward, a spiritual salvation for thousands of girls on the brink of despair. On 0.5, the second perspective, HQ-I-III, from HQ-I-V, military commanders, reveals that managing tens of thousands of female prisoners was a colossal tactical pressure. Colonel Roy Cunningham, who directly oversaw a female detention camp in Western Germany, noted in his report to command that keeping these women in their old uniforms was a fuel for resistance. He decided to completely change their attire to civilian clothing, not just for humanitarian reasons, but to dismantle the organizational nature of the auxiliary forces. Once they no longer wore uniforms, HQ-I-III, they were no longer military units. They returned to being individuals. HQ-I-V. This tactic reduced the rates of defiance and suicide in the camp to nearly zero within the first 2 weeks. The third perspective, HQ-I-III, regarding technology and logistics, HQ-I-III, is a testament to the incredible production power of the United States. To provide millions of meters of floral fabric and civilian clothing for Europe, American textile factories had to switch production lines from military tents to civilian apparel in a very short time. These floral dresses were effectively soft weapons in the battle for the hearts and minds of the German people. Statistics show that every female prisoner was issued a new set of clothes upon release, including a dress, undergarments, and leather shoes, items that even German civilians at the time could not find at any price on the black market. The fourth perspective, on the ethical dimension, shows the U.S. military faced an extremely difficult decision: classifying women who were merely clerical workers versus those directly involved in war crimes at German concentration camps. Here, a heartbreaking paradox occurred. HQ-I-V. Some German nurses sobbed when treated with respect by American soldiers.
September
0.3.
1945.
Yet they were the same individuals who had watched other prisoners starve to death in labor camps. American compassion became a bitter medicine, forcing them to face their own consciences while receiving kindness from those they considered enemies. 0.5. A slight twist at the end of this section is a little-known secret. 5. Among the vibrant floral dresses issued to female prisoners, quite a few were sewn from the very curtains and tablecloths seized from the former villas of Nazi officials. A bitter irony of history, symbols of luxury in the Third Reich now became the prisoner garb of those who once served it. 5. This truth leads us to deeper insights into the leaders and the profound social impacts behind the barbed wire. The fifth perspective, Point 3, from the leadership and high command, Point 3, reveals a hidden conflict within the U, 5S, 5, military management. 5. On one side were the battlefield generals, and 3 kings, exhausted by bloody combat, and 3, who wanted to apply iron-fisted discipline and viewed German female auxiliaries as dangerous accomplices. On the other side were experts from the civil affairs branch, 3, who believed that punishment only breeds perpetual hatred. 5. General Dwight Eisenhower eventually leaned toward the more humanitarian side, signing a decree allowing civilian relief organizations access to the female camps. He understood that every German woman returning home with a favorable view of America would be worth more than an occupying division. This shift in command led to an unprecedented psychological tactic, turning POW camps into classrooms for democracy and tolerance. The sixth perspective, Point 3, on the tactical re-education process, Point 3, reveals a meticulously calculated procedure. Instead of forcing female prisoners to listen to dry political lectures, Point 3, the Americans chose to influence daily life. Issuing floral dresses, 3, mirrors, 3, and makeup kits was seen as a tactic to break military collectivism. As a woman began to care for her personal appearance, 3, she began to detach from the herd mentality of fascism. 5. Military psychological reports noted that as personal self-esteem was restored, the dependence on political idols like Hitler began to sharply decline. This was a strategic mistake the Nazi side never anticipated. They had relied too heavily on absolute loyalty, forgetting that the need to be a normal human being is always stronger than any extremist ideal. The seventh perspective, 3, on social influence, Point 3, shows that the story of the floral dresses left a profound legacy within post-war German society. 5 told these women, Point 3 upon release, Point 3 took with them not only new clothes but unprecedented experiences of personal freedom and respect from American men. 5 in the ruins of Germany, Point 3, where German men were either dead or in labor camps in Russia, and 3, these women in floral dresses became the core force for rebuilding society. They brought a more open mindset, were ready to accept new values, and became vital bridges for the future German-American relationship. This change created a healthy cultural shock, helping German society transform from a militaristic empire to a democratic nation within a single generation. A major twist at the end of this section is the reality of the reaction from American women back home. Dear Pod, when news broke that the clothes they had donated were being given to the enemy's female prisoners, 3, there was initially a fierce wave of protest in the United States. 5. However, Point 3, after photos were published in major newspapers showing gaunt, Point 3, tattered German female prisoners weeping as they received floral dresses, Point 3, American public sentiment changed completely. 5. They realized that humanity knows no borders. Point 3. And it was this compassion that was the true victory for the Allies. 5. This created an intense emotional climax, leading us to the turning point of the script, where the final shifts of fate would be determined. The true turning point did not take place on a smoke-filled battlefield, but on the central campgrounds of Frankfurt on a gray afternoon in June 1945. This was the moment the U.S. military enforced a mandatory procedure called the naked truth.
and again.
0.5.
Keep the
After being
rhythm
dressed in
steady.
their new floral gowns and regaining some health, thousands of female prisoners were gathered to watch the first documentary footage of Germany's own concentration camps at Buchenwald
You
and
think the spring will
Dachau.
be
So
peaceful this year?
0.5. This was the
God
most
willing.
bitter grand reward in the
almond
flow
trees
of
are
this
already
narrative.
blooming.
0.5. These women, who had just begun to feel the warmth of American humanity, now had to face the unimaginable brutality committed by the very empire they once served. 0.5. The projector hummed in the suffocating silence. 0.3. And then, stifled sobs began to rise. 0.5. Many fainted. Others covered their faces. 0.3. Unable to believe that their own nursing colleagues or commanders could have had a hand in such horrific crimes. Data from Psychological Warfare Unit reports indicated that over 90% of female prisoners fell into a state of severe psychological shock after the screening. 0.5. The contrast at this moment reached the peak of tragedy. 0.5. They were wearing soft floral dresses, symbols of life and the future, but their eyes were witnessing mass burial pits and gaunt bodies that were nothing but skin and bones, victims of the Allied cause. 5. A massive cognitive twist occurred. 0.5. A female auxiliary named Gertrude quoted in her diary, 0.5. I looked down at the vibrant floral dress I was wearing and felt a piercing sense of shame in my soul. 0.5. How can we dress beautifully when our compatriots committed these things? 0.5. American kindness was no longer a simple gift. It became a mirror reflecting the darkness of their own consciences. 0.5 bonds. Why was this a strategic turning point? 0.5 point. Because at this very moment, 0.3, the final resistance in their minds collapsed entirely. 0.5. They realized that the old uniform was not just a piece of clothing, 0.3, but an invisible shackle that had locked away their compassion for so long. 0.5. The fact that the Americans did not punish them with whips but with truth and tolerance was the fatal blow to the will of the most loyal. A strategic error of the Nazi propaganda machine was turning these women into steel dolls, as 0.3. But with just a few rolls of film and a little human touch from American soldiers, as 0.3, that steel shell melted into tears of remorse. 0.5 star. This event permanently altered the psychological structure of thousands of female prisoners. 5. They no longer saw themselves as soldiers of a defeated empire, but as witnesses to a dark era that needed to be cleansed.
Here, take a little more.
This climax
It will
leads
help
us
you
to the
heal.
immediate consequences, where the transformation from enemies into friends, into people who would rebuild peace, began to form more powerfully and clearly than ever before. Following the shock of the documentary screening, a wave of powerful psychological transformation swept through the Frankfurt detention camp. The climax did not end with tears. It turned into concrete actions. HQ.I-II. These German women, 0.3, in floral dresses that still smelled of new fabric, 0.3, began to do something no one had asked. 5. They voluntarily formed teams to care for the survivors of the recently liberated concentration camps nearby. 5. This was the direct result of the humanitarian strategy, the U. 5. Yes. 0.5. Military had persistently pursued. 0.5. The hatred between the victor and the vanquished was now replaced by a common goal. 0.5. Saving those who were barely clinging to life. 0.5. Statistics from U.5.S. Military medical records noted an extraordinary phenomenon. 0.5. The productivity of German female auxiliaries in field hospitals soared after they were given a new appearance and access to the truth, 0.555. They worked 16 hours a day, some 0.33. Not because of superior orders, so 0.3, but because of the call of their consciences, 0.5. An American nurse named Ruth wrote in a letter to her family, 0.5 hours. I cannot believe that these women who were enemies only yesterday are now kneeling to wash the wounds of those whom their own army had tortured. 0.5. The vibrant floral dresses moving through the stark white hospital corridors created a contrast full of hope. Our 0.5, however, 3.3. This transformation also brought painful personal consequences. 5. Many female prisoners. 3.3. Upon learning the truth. 3.3s decided to sever ties with their families if they discovered their relatives were high-ranking officials in the Nazi Party. Brant. The collapse of the Third Reich was no longer a military defeat on a map, but a total disintegration within the very cells of the German family. Another peak twist occurred when some female prisoners requested to strip away the rank insignia hidden in their personal belongings to hand over to the UN-05 military as a way of completely cutting ties with the past. They preferred to wear simple civilian clothes rather than keep any trace of an ignominious era. On the U.5HS or Submarine 5 military side, the success of the floral dress campaign spread to other POW camps throughout the occupied territories. Reports sent back to Washington confirmed that the cost of civilian clothing and supplementary food for prisoners was an incredibly cheap investment compared to the cost of maintaining a massive occupying force to suppress rebellions. This calculated compassion completely extinguished the seeds of underground resistance movements in their infancy. These women were the first ambassadors to bring the message of a prosperous and humane America back to every village and every street of a ruined Germany. The immediate consequence was an astonishing stability in the controlled zones. There were no assassinations of American soldiers, R3, no violent strikes from German women, Instead, R3, a new symbiotic relationship had formed, This event leads us to the long-term consequences, where the casualty figures were tallied, but more importantly, where historical lessons on the power of compassion changed the course of an entire continent. As the winds of the Great War finally subsided, the tallying of numbers and losses revealed a haunting picture of the price of collapse. According to military archive documents, HQ.I-III, after the temporary detention camps in Western Germany closed in late 1945, and 0.3, over 400,000 women from the auxiliary forces had been released. 0.5. The material losses were immeasurable, as 0.3, but the loss of life and spirit was the true 0.3 enduring pain. Tens of thousands of women would never be able to find their families again in the rubble of bombed cities like Dresden or Berlin. The tactical consequence for the German side was the total eradication of a generation trained under militaristic ideology. Forcing them to burn their uniforms and replace them with floral dresses was not just a change of clothes, it was effectively stripping away the war tools of the Third Reich. The HQ.I-II noted that through this campaign, or3, they prevented the formation of female guerrilla groups that Hitler had hoped would cause difficulties for the occupying forces. Instead of dealing with terrorists, HQ.I-III, the American military received the cooperation of women who wanted to rebuild their lives. An analysis from official reports indicated that the cost of millions of sets of civilian clothing and food supplies for female prisoners was only 1/10 of the cost of maintaining security had these camps rioted. This was a victory in logistical strategy and psychological warfare that the Allies executed brilliantly. However, a forgotten aspect of history is the fate of women caught between two fires. Many, despite wearing floral dresses and returning home, still faced stigma from the German community for being seen as traitors who accepted help from the enemy. A slight twist in this section is the reality of those floral dresses after the war ended. Years later, in German history museums, people still find old, worn scraps of floral fabric preserved like treasures. For those women, they were not just prisoner garb, but evidence of the moment they were treated as human beings after years of being turned into soulless war tools. This tactical consequence created a new class of residents in West Germany, women with realistic mindsets who understood the value of peace and tolerance, laying the foundation for Germany's miraculous post-war recovery. This shift leads us to the final part of our story, 0.3, where historical lessons on humanity and the power of compassion will be summarized. Pre, leaving deep reflections on how we treat one another even in the darkest hours of mankind. 0. Domis, looking back at history from a distance of over 80 years. 0.3. The story of the German female prisoners and the floral dresses is not just a small fragment of the post-war era. It has become a symbol of the transformation of an entire nation. The women who walked out of American detention camps in 1945 were the generation that directly laid the first bricks to build a new Germany. 0.5. They were called the women of the rubble, Trümmerfrauen, those who used the hands that once held rifles to clear millions of tons of debris. 0.3. Restore cities. 0.3. And raise a generation of Germans who feared war. The long-term impact of this humane treatment policy created a solid foundation for the Allied relationship between the U and 0.5 and West Germany throughout the Cold War. 0.5. Instead of an occupied nation filled with perpetual hatred, 0.3. Germany became a trusted partner of the West. 5. Modern historians suggest that without those humanitarian gestures, such as issuing floral dresses, 3. Medicine, 3. and food in the early days of occupation, the democratization of Germany might have taken many more decades and been filled with needless bloodshed. The greatest lesson we draw is that punishment can subdue an army, but only compassion can reclaim a nation. The script of the women in ash-gray uniforms and vibrant floral dresses closes with a haunting image, that of raging campfires where the last Nazi uniforms were incinerated to make way for the rebirth of human goodness. War can strip away everything, from homes and families to dignity, but it can never entirely extinguish the human longing to live a normal life and be respected. The tears of the female prisoners, as they saw themselves in the mirror with new clothes, was the moment truth triumphed over the lies of the propaganda machine. 0.5. We close this chapter of history not to forget the pain, and 0.3, but to remember that even in the darkest hours of humanity, 0.3, the light of compassion always finds a way. 0.5. Those floral dresses are a reminder that peace is not merely signed with documents on a desk. It begins with the smallest acts of kindness between those who once considered each other enemies. 5. Thank you for following this emotional historical journey. 0.5. The truth about the German female prisoners is only a small part of the vast mural of the hidden corners of the Second World War. 0.5. If you wish to learn more about the fates of other women who changed the course of history in this conflict, and 0.13, click on the video appearing on your screen about the courageous nurses on the Pacific Front. 2.5. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next documentary films. 0.5. We will see you again in historical stories that have never been told. 0.5.